So we assume that we humans make art and other species don't. When a fish makes an incredibly elaborate shape in the sand that's huge compared to the size of the fish, this is the puffer fish that you mentioned, and takes a week to make it, and David Attenborough very confidently says this is a mating ritual for attracting another fish, how do we know with absolute certainty that what this fish is making is not indeed also art?
Thank you for tuning in and welcome to the first episode of Season 2 of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. I am recording this introduction the day after our trailer for Season 2 dropped, and we've gotten nothing but positive feedback about delving into the arts for Season 2. I'm really excited. I think we're going to have some incredible conversations this season, and we have an absolutely fantastic one to start us off. Lucia Pietroiusti is the Head of Ecologies at the Serpentine in London. If you aren't familiar with the Serpentine, it is a contemporary art gallery in Kensington Gardens, and better yet, admission to the galleries is totally free for all visitors, making it incredibly accessible. Right before I moved from London earlier this year, I visited the Serpentine to see its Inca Shinobare exhibition, Suspended States, which earned a 5-star review from The Guardian and featured his African bird magic quilt series that examines the harm to the environment caused by colonial industrialization. Lucia is one of the driving forces behind the Serpentine's work as a curator, programmer, and organizational strategist. As the head of ecologies, she works at the intersection of art, ecology, and systems. Her role is to embed environmental responsibility throughout the Serpentine's infrastructure, operations, networks, and programming. She also happened to create this role out of the General Ecology project we discussed in the episode that she started in 2018. However, her influence stretches well beyond the bounds of Kensington Gardens. She was the curator for the Golden Lion-winning opera performance Sun and Sea at the Lithuanian Pavilion at the 58th Venice Biennale, and the Songs for the Changing Seasons exhibition at Vienna's first Climate Biennale earlier this year. After you listen to the episode, make sure to check out our website that is linked in the show notes, because this is just the tip of the iceberg of her work. If you aren't subscribed to our Substack, you can also visit ecosystemmember.com to do so, to check out a post with photos and videos of many of the projects we talk about in this episode. We're going to try to do a bit more with the Substack this season to help you learn more about our guests and amazing art around the world. So make sure to subscribe. And to that point, 2 exhibitions that are going on right now that I want to highlight in particular. So first, if you are in London, at the Natural History Museum, sound artist Jana Vierden has created what looks like an absolutely amazing experience of the River Thames using hydrophonic recordings. Second, if you are in Paris, the Palais de Tokyo has an exhibition from Julien Charret titled Stone Speakers, The Sounds of the Earth. In this exhibition, you actually enter a volcanic landscape and a symbolic crater to listen to the sounds of Earth captured in real time using global seismic data. Julian was recently awarded the Eric and Wendy Schmidt Environment and Art Prize from the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. Huge thanks to everyone who is tuning in, and if you enjoy this episode, please make sure to leave us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or if you use YouTube, give us a thumbs up on that platform. Those are key signals to the platforms that this content is interesting and valuable, and it helps it become more discoverable to other potential listeners. And it helps us keep attracting great guests like Lucia. So thanks for listening, and enjoy the first episode of Season 2 of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with Lucia Pietroiusti, Head of Ecologies at the Serpentine in London. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are excited to welcome Lucia Pietroiusti, Head of Ecologies at the Serpentine in London. Thanks for joining us today, Lucia.
Thanks so much for having me, Rick.
So your role, Head of Ecology, some people might wonder what that is. So maybe you can give us a little bit of an explanation from it, because it came out of this project called General Ecology that you launched. And, it's about embedding environmental subjects and methods throughout the Serpentine, sort of at this intersection of art, ecology, and systems. So, what are you finding at this intersection? Like, how does that work with your role? Like, what does your day-to-day look like as the Head of Ecologies at the Serpentine?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, Serpentine is a contemporary art gallery. We don't have a collection, and that makes it quite easy for us to lean quite heavily on questions around the public good and research, because so much of our activity doesn't have to be turned towards looking after objects in our collection. Um, I'm a curator by formation. I came from studying literature and critical theory and gender studies and all kinds of things like this, which meant that I was always a slightly sort of um, restless uh, curator when it came to sticking to a single discipline. So I always worked across disciplines even before starting this project called General Ecology. But as a result of working on, I guess, research-led and public programming for so long and working with so many practitioners from different worlds, the environmental emergency, climate breakdown, the social emergencies that come with what we call now the polycrisis, emerged very clearly as one of the things that was concerning us all, in a sense, in different ways and from different situated positions. So when I came back, interestingly, from being away because I had a baby, I came back and I wrote a project for Serpentine that I suggested calling General Ecology, that essentially sort of set itself the goal of placing environmental justice and balance at the heart of the organization's mission. Now, we all know that organizations have a mission, but what if a museum, as a kind of prototype for any other organization as well, what if it set itself the aim of doing that with a view towards playing a part, not necessarily the leading part, but playing a part in struggle towards environmental justice and balance? What would that mean? How would it change us? And so my agency at the time as a curator of public programs was to program and curate, and so that's what I did. I started to redirect all of our efforts towards these themes and these topics that were so fascinating to people, but that somehow would lead them back into a conversation around the environmental and environmental belonging at large, I suppose. So from that, we gathered over time, of course, over the years. This was 2018, although we had a precedent of programming since for at least 4 or 5 years before that. From that, we gathered what I keep calling a community of interest, essentially a number of audience members that really recognized Serpentine as an organization that not only had something to say about it, but was doing something about it, and to a certain extent was sticking with it, right? Because one thing is to do a big group show about it and then just move on to the next subject matter. The other is to really say, well, this is one of our core pillars of thought and research and commissioning. And so that had the, I suppose, unplanned but lucky effect of mirroring back an image of Serpentine to itself. And suddenly there was a willingness across all of the layers of the institution to really live up to that mirror, which was, I guess, one of the consequences of developing a project like this, if we wanted to think in very strategic ways. That itself got me thinking about how working through systems and trying to work into systems and figure out how systems work could be also a very interesting avenue for me as a programmer and as a curator. And then fast forward a few years later, we've done all this work. And then around 2023, it becomes clear that, well, if we are this invested into this as a subject matter, then we need to find a holistic way of being invested in it as an entire organization. After designing the project, I suggested a role which has as an aim to, I guess, synchronize all of the interactions that this particular organization, which happens to be a contemporary art gallery, has with the ecological and the environmental, and make sure that those pieces of the puzzle talk to each other. Because on the one hand, you can say, well, all we need to do is make shows or make programs about the climate crisis or about environmental justice. You could take it the completely other way and say the main thing that we need to do is cut our emissions by 30%. But actually, each branch of the organization can do something different. If you're working with audiences, you can incentivize them to change particular behaviors. If you're working with artists, you can commission works. If you're working with buildings, you can look at your energy and your waste and so on. So why would we have a one-size-fits-all model if we create this, if we have the possibility to create this, I guess, amorphous, flexible, adaptive department which works with everybody else. So Head of Ecologies is a role that doesn't really exist, just like curator of General Ecology didn't exist when we set it up in contemporary art organizations. But it has this kind of systemic approach, curatorially inspired, I guess, or curatorially led, very much artist-leaning and artist-led systemic approach to how do you work holistically across an entire organization, I suppose.
That's really interesting. I think one of the ideas behind sort of season 2 of the podcast is that the world of art can ask really big questions that other spaces can't. And the way you're describing Head of Ecologies, I'm not really sure how many other organizations, especially in sort of a traditional capitalist model, would be able to have this type of role that asks questions. There's one project that I know you're working on, The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish. The project asked this question: what does this activity look like in a fish's mind? Which, really big question, like kind of a far out question. And that project, I think, launched in 2018. What insights have you had about consciousness? Has that project changed how you think about that differently? Has that changed how, like, the Serpentine as an organization thinks about consciousness differently?
I don't know, Rick, if you've ever done a PhD. I'm a PhD dropout, so I can speak from my position of relative ignorance, which was the distinct feeling that I had at the time, that the more I went into the PhD, the less I knew about the subject that I was studying. And that's because the more you know, the less you know, because the universe is made of infinitely complex universes that open the more you go deep, right? That's just the way it is. So strangely, the more my colleague Felipe Ramos and I, who co-curate this project, The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, the more time we've spent looking at it, the more elusive the insights have been. As you say, it's probably a question that will never have an answer because there is no way of experiencing the world outside of our own experience. What we wanted to do was less find the answer and more ask the question in many more different ways, and also shift our audiences in our own consciousness away from assumed concepts that we hold as humans. I'll make you some examples. So we assume that we humans make art and other species don't. When a fish makes an incredibly elaborate shape in the sand that's huge compared to the size of the fish, this is the puffer fish that you mentioned, and takes a week to make it, and David Attenborough very confidently says this is a mating ritual for attracting another fish, how do we know with absolute certainty that what this fish is making is not indeed also art? That is to say, you can reverse the question as well. How do we know with absolute certainty that what we make as art is not part of some larger evolutionary dance where we're programmed to do so? You can ask that question in two different directions. When we say that, when we describe humor, how can we know with absolute certainty that a plant that is reaching one of its tendrils to the plant next to it in order to, I guess, thieve some of its nutrients doesn't have a certain amount of humor in it? Well, of course, a scientist, and many scientists that we've had an occasion to talk to over the years, would say, oh, that's anthropomorphizing, that's the biggest mistake that science could ever make, and that's projecting everything that's ours or human onto other species that are completely different and have a completely different experience of the world. That's absolutely true. But for me, what we also need to recognize when we look at these questions and when we relate to non-human species is the fact that we define our concepts really narrowly because we define them in our image. So we think we know what humor is because we recognize it, because we've defined it in the shape in which human humor appears. We think we know what love is because we define it in our own image. And then anything that falls out of that self-definition falls out forever, falls out for good. So I guess The Shape of a Circle in the Mind of a Fish, which is a research project, but we've done festivals with, artists and musicians and scientists and philosophers and what have you, lots of anthropologists It's also been a podcast series. It's also been a series of smaller publications. We're now publishing a huge kind of 400-page compendium of the first 6 years of this project. It'll come out next year. It was a way of gathering a group of people, audience members and participants, and just throw some, if you can imagine it as like, here's some stars in the sky, and everyone who's coming to participate in it will make their own shape and make their own constellations out of it. We're not ever in a position in which we can prescribe how to understand the way that humans can, do, or should relate to and with more than human species. Our aim with this project was always to open the possible channels of, I guess, belonging, relating, empathy, solidarity that we have at our disposal, and that we have at our disposal with, well, not even all humans, but that we have at our disposal as capabilities, and that we could develop further. That, by the way, and I should say just as an anecdote that the title came to me in a session with my shrink. That, by the way, is something that came up because I had a baby. So suddenly I had quite a difficult time of it, and I over-intellectualized the experience because that's what I do when I have a difficult time. And I realized that I was being taught by my son to develop forms of connection and responsibility and I guess care for him before his being capable of expressing what his needs were to me. So we do this, we do this with our babies. We don't know what they're saying. They're just screaming at us, not letting us sleep, which plants, by the way, don't do, but cats sometimes do. And we develop relationships of responsibility. And the more time, I mean, if you speak to gardeners, which I do a lot, it's just, they're poets, it's the most beautiful relationship, because the more time they've spent with these beings, the more they recognize their behaviors, the more they're able to communicate with them.
I think it's really interesting. You mentioned anthropomorphizing. It was something I talked to Melanie Challenger in season 1 about, who wrote the book How to Be Animal. And I was actually this weekend reading a book by a writer, Joseph Wood Crutch, The Great Chain of Life. And he has this great line in there that essentially sums up how I kind of think about it. And it sounds like this might resonate with you. Let me know if it does. Like, I think it was, to paraphrase, it was like something like, I'd rather run a risk of assigning too much and like almost having too great of empathy with these non-human species than assigning too little. And that kind of dictates how you see that relationship there, and that relationship of responsibility, as well, as you mentioned. Like, when we think about anthropomorphizing, and I think this is where art's really interesting versus science, is that we can explore and ask questions without necessarily needing to come to an answer. And that could mean assigning a little more rather than a little less. Like, does that resonate?
It resonates a lot. And it is the case, and this is, I think, why we've worked with so many anthropologists, that with the exception of the prescriptions that Western science has set up for itself, most epistemologies, most ways of knowing in the world over and throughout time, assign human-like qualities to non-human beings. Western science is the only one that insists on not doing so. We talk about animisms, vitalisms, all kinds of other isms. But the crucial part of that is, and there's an anthropologist that puts it in a very erudite way, better than I ever can, a Brazilian anthropologist called Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. When he's describing the societies in which he's conducted fieldwork, he's essentially saying the category of human itself, like the me that has a belonging to a certain group of other me's, is a category that, if you change the perspective of which being it is in the forest, then they're the human, as it were. They're the center of that kind of organization of space. And so he says something very, very kind of striking, which is, to a jaguar, the jaguar is human and blood is beer, and so forth. So if we start to understand these categories as categories that organize our thoughts, but then before we know it, mask the complexity and the fullness of the world away from us through that very organization, then we start to have the possibility, at least, to start to loosen those things up a little bit. Now, obviously, there's no better place. As you said, there's no better place than the arts to do so because, well, first of all, because we don't operate on hearts and we don't work in war zones. I mean, many art institutions are in war zones, but as an industry, as a field, we can fail. And, hopefully nobody is terribly harmed by our failures. And so that means that we can experiment and take greater risks, and that we can also spend time doing things that other industries just simply don't have time to do, or it's not fixed within the system. This is all we do. It's our bread and butter. So for me, I resonate enormously with this sentiment that you've brought up. And I would say it's almost a responsibility for us to be able to play with forms of knowing and to expand this particular dominant form of knowing and just going, we're not saying that anyone is wrong or right here. We're just saying that if you start to look at it from this slightly different perspective, things start to look very, very, very different. So why don't we start to play around with these different epistemologies and see if we can sit in them for a little while and see what that feels like and how we relate to each other differently if we do.
And on that idea of different perspectives, another of the projects that you've been working on, the Infinite Ecologies Marathon, which I think started in 2014, with Gustav Metzger was involved in helping launching that, and then it's continued on recently, and there's been a couple of events this summer, and there was one session with the artist Marcus Coates, talking with soil, and you reflecting on the role of listening, which is definitely like a different perspective, and also maybe something that when we think about the Serpentine prototyping. Taking that time to listen to like this interpretation of discussion with soil. Many organizations might not have the space to do. And as you just pointed out, like in the art world, there's opportunity to experience risk and take risks because because the seriousness is not the same as certain other areas. So when you think about like what other organizations, maybe outside the world of art and people outside the world of art can learn from something like having a session where you reflect on the role of listening when an artist engages with soil, what can people who aren't necessarily in the art world take away from how you're approaching that?
So you're right in mentioning that the Marathon Festival started in 2006 as a result of the arrival of my current director, Hans-Ulrich Oberst, at Serpentine. And in 2014, we worked with Gustav Metzger, who was one of the very first artists who really raised the alarm about environmental devastation decades ago, back in the 70s. And Gustav insisted that we dedicate that year's Marathon Festival 2014 to the theme of extinction. Which dates, I suppose, the beginning of this research back about 10 years. After that, I remember very clearly going to Hans-Ulrich and suggesting that, I guess because the subject had hit me so deeply or something like this, suggesting that essentially we should continue to dedicate the marathon to extinction every year, as opposed to changing the topic every year as we used to do. Now, we didn't do that, but every marathon that happened after that was a slight declination on that theme, secretly, I suppose. So it sounded like something new, but it was actually just trying to continue a sentence, let's say. It took a little break, and we returned with the Infinite Ecologies Marathon, which we decided purposefully we weren't even going to run exactly as a festival. We were going to run it as a long-term, I guess, program. In part because we're looking at a very, very different world that we were looking at back in 2014. And I suppose with this expansion, what we wanted to also say is, let's not forget another role that the art organization can have, which is the role of holding extremely difficult feelings and imaginations and conversations in a space that, in the best of cases, is relatively safe. And if we look at the state of the polycrisis today, I think that kind of almost palliative role, that kind of holding space. I ended up doing some death doula training and palliative care training and psychotherapy training as a result of thinking about this. But like, how do we get our audiences, the artists and so on, through these really large transitions, with hope and enthusiasm and desire to connect and feeling of environmental belonging, and also with space for those things that need to be faced that don't always feel positive all the time, right? I've become more and more convinced that one of the roles of art organizations is to make space for those experiences of the sacred that used to have institutions that could hold them, and now, generally speaking, don't. Of course, those institutions come with their own huge problems and the violences that they've caused and so on throughout history. But I think there is something about the experience of the day-to-day experience that people had, outside of our hyper-wired urban kind of daily life, the experience that people had of the things we cannot directly see or hear in our immediate day-to-day. Now, of course, if you stop or if you make a space for it, then suddenly some of the things you cannot usually see or hear make themselves known. We not just through intuition, but even just attention or attentiveness to what's around. And I guess what art can teach or can bring to other environments is just a, desire for that attentiveness. I'm asked the question of what an ecological artist is. And I have a very simple, I guess, borderline, overly simple definition for it, so that it can be as vast as possible and open up as many possibilities as there are forms of imagination. That is to say that for me, an ecological artist, or by extension, an ecological practice, is an artist or a practice that is aware of the fact that they're part of the planet and not a separate piece of it, is aware of the fact that they belong to this planet, and then act in accordance to that awareness. And that means developing practices of attention, developing practices of remediation and repair, developing practices of, say, systems change. You can do whatever you want. If you're an artist, you can go and try and fix the educational curriculum of Canada as much as you can, plant a garden at the back of the museum, as much as you can make a beautifully inspirational film about a particular subject that is connected to our belonging in the planet, or indeed questions of justice. I'm not prescriptive about that. The only thing that I hold on to is the fact that for me to have a practice that is ecological requires a kind of acknowledgement of belonging, first and foremost. So I think what can people glean from it? Well, we can start from the daily practices through which we bring in the things that we cannot hear and that we cannot see immediately, the things that stop us on our track of consuming, throwing away, despairing, and starting over. The things that bring us to practices of attention. We can start to make those spaces for others, spaces in which we can just experience. And before we know it, those things bring us to a consciousness of our belonging to this planet. And everything else just flows directly from. Now, that before I, sound too optimistic, of course, I don't believe that we all experience or endure these massive systems that determine our lives in the same way. We absolutely don't. And in fact, there's, definitely situations in which the worst effects of climate breakdown are being imposed on those who are least responsible for them. That's been the case for hundreds of years, in fact. But that's why there's an insistence in my practice on systems as well. We have to acknowledge the fact that our own kind of internal transformation is absolutely necessary. It is necessary to belong to a particular change of systems, which will require, a much larger kind of unit to be able to shift, right? So it's always an interplay, but I think that the internal contradictions that we hold ourselves in terms of what our desires are and how much we belong and so on, lie at the root of quite a lot of or unlock. As soon as we unlock those, we unlock quite a lot of new things that we didn't think we could see or feel even.
And that definition of an ecological artist and sort of awareness of being part of the planet or part of the system. So going back to the pufferfish, so maybe this is like at least so far, what I've been thinking about, like there's two ways to look at this. One is that the pufferfish is aware, like an artist, whether it's human or non-human, could be aware of it's part of a system and acting this out, and that could also make them an ecological artist. Or if we think about it another way, are there certain things that, non-human pufferfish does that we can look at as art that maybe we would naturally do as humans that maybe in some ways we've suppressed, and means that we're actually closer to that non-human when we think about what is an ecological artist and what is not? Does that make sense? Like, can the pufferfish be an ecological artist, or is there something about the art that the pufferfish does that maybe we've suppressed as humans?
Well, that's a brilliant question. I don't necessarily have an answer to it because of the fact that the experience of a non-human being is so fundamentally inaccessible to us. A part of me does feel like this responsibility towards responsibility, let's say, is one that we as human hold quite unlike other non-human species. But that's because the last 150 years have caused quite the wreckage. And as a result, there is a obligation to attend to that responsibility on the part of humans. But what your question does bring up is the fact that it's also important when we imagine the environment to which we belong, not to assume that everything about it is innocent and good. And if you remember that I guess death and violence are inherent parts of the way in which the planet, I guess, works, as is generosity and the sharing of resources and so on. So we don't want to idolize nature either. The humans are bad and nature is good and whatever. In fact, we don't really necessarily want to separate from nature at all to be able to say one thing or another. But I do think that there is a certain self-awareness in this kind of definition of ecological artist, self-awareness of a kind of inherited mess to clean up, right? An inherited mess to clean up in order to pass it on better, which is, if I can be human exceptionalist for just half a second, I think this is one thing that we should take on ourselves, really.
I love that idea. And I think, maybe looking at how we wrap our conversation here, thinking about this responsibility and this obligation, you work at this intersection of art, ecology, and systems. What do you think the future is, whether it's from an environmental justice lens, a more than humans lens? What do you think about that responsibility and obligation going into the future? What has you excited about sort of the opportunity in that obligation?
Yeah, I mean, there's challenges and opportunities for sure. I think we are living through quite challenging moments, and I think there is a responsibility to attend to that challenge and that, these massive transformations with, to quote the amazing Vanessa Machado de Oliveira, who is the author of a book I love called Hospicing Modernity. She says to attend to these big challenges and transformations with discernment, humility, and grace. So that's one thing. On the other, I think that if we start to move the conversation a little bit past that dichotomy that I was describing to you of carbon reduction over here, awareness raising over here, and we let art really bloom into what it's been doing best, which is really imagining alternative ways of knowing, imagining alternative worlds, to essentially world make, to be a kind of little factory of world making, then we might be giving ourselves and our greatest, to a certain extent, our greatest technology that we've ever built is our creativity. We might be giving it a chance, I think. And so for me, what's exciting about the future of that intersection is just artists and creative practitioners at large in general starting to see that their agency can be a lot further out than what they sort of start to think. And if you dig into the histories of this, and I've done a lot of it because, of course, I spend all of my days advocating for why art is important. But if you dig into the history of this, you find that very, very few human things have lasted as long as a song, a story, a myth, or a poem have, or even a cave painting. Very, very few things. We don't know how to make things that are more resilient than our art and our culture. And so it is only at the level of our art and our culture that we can make these massive shifts of our, ways of understanding ourselves and the world and ourselves in the world, and the kind of big paradigms that hold everything together.
Fantastic. That is a beautiful way to end it. Thank you so much, Lucia, for joining us on Ecosystem Member today.
Thank you.